So now that we have a good idea of how research may help us improve our clinical practice, let's talk about some of these research terms that I've mentioned. The reason why these terms are so important is I'm going to be using them throughout the class, and you need to understand what I mean, especially if I tell you to go out and find a primary article or a secondary article. You'll need to know the difference so you know what type of articles you're looking for. So let's talk about some of these different research terms. The first two terms that I would like to go over is the term research question and hypothesis. While these two terms are related, they're different. A research question tends to be, the general question around which you center your research. It's typically much more broad. So in the example I've been using of hamstring injuries, my question is, what interventions are effective in decreasing the risk or the rate of hamstring injury. So it's pretty broad, and it could include stretching, it could include strengthening, it could include a variety of different interventions. A hypothesis, however, is much more specific. It's still a question or a proposed idea that then can be studied. So a hypothesis, I'll read this first, is a supposition or a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. So it's kind of an educated guess that then is going to be tested in most cases by a researcher. So again, it's based upon previous research or things that, again, make sense based upon what we know already. But it does, when we make a hypothesis or create a hypothesis, we make it without any assumption of truth. So often a researcher will have a hypothesis or a guess that they then have to be unbiased and then look for evidence to support it. So let's take a closer look at what a research question is and what a hypothesis is by looking at a couple different studies. So let's look at this title of an article that's out in the literature right now. The title of the article is "The Effects of Vibration and Non-Vibration Foam Rolling on Recovery After Exercise with Induced Muscle Damage." So these research articles that you're going to read often have fairly complex titles, but the titles will tell us a lot about the study and obviously are kind of our initial evaluation of the article in our attempt to decide if it's something we want to read, something that may benefit us, something that we find of interest and can then use in our clinical practice. So often the titles will have a lot of information, but first off, we're talking about the research question and the hypothesis. So a research question, this person that did, or this group that did this research, they seem to be interested in foam rolling, right? They seem to be interested in foam rolling and its ability to help improve recovery after exercise, specifically exercise that has induced muscle damage. So they're probably looking at, is foam rolling beneficial for recovery? That would probably be their line of research, their area of interest. That would be their research question. However, there's lots of ways to foam roll, right? There's lots of tissues we can foam roll on. We can use it on people before exercise. After exercise, we can use it to try to increase range of motion. We can use it to try to improve recovery, and so on. So the general question they probably have, the research question they have is foam rolling beneficial for physically active people? Their hypothesis for this particular study, however, is probably something like vibration foam rolling will improve recovery to a greater extent than non-vibration foam rolling. So they're trying to give us a very specific answer is, if we have this decision, if I have in my gym foam rolls that can vibrate and those that don't, is it beneficial to use one over the other? Or maybe I only have non-vibrating foam rollers in my gym. Should I spend the money to get the vibrating foam rollers? Is there an added benefit? So again, this study tells me a couple important things that I may choose then to read further on. But again, the research question is, what are the benefits of foam rolling? Comparing vibration and non-vibration foam rolling. Their specific hypothesis is examining the comparison of these two foam rollers, specifically on recovery, measures of recovery, after exercise that has induced muscle damage. So something that's probably caused some aspect of DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness. So again, if we look at what the difference is between a research question versus a research hypothesis, a research question is more general, something like, does self-myofascial release decrease muscle soreness after a workout? A more specific application of that, or a hypothesis that still falls under this research question, might be, does the application of 60 seconds of foam rolling and static stretching treatment decrease muscle soreness when compared to stretching alone? So we can specifically look at a combination of treatments on a specific measure. So hypotheses are going to be more specific. Another example might be, does timing of protein intake affect strength gains? Again, should we take in this protein right after exercise, or does it not matter? We can eat whenever. A specific hypothesis related to that research question might be, ingestion of an amino acid supplement within 1 hour post-exercise is more effective in stimulating protein synthesis than 8 hours post-exercise. So that gives you kind of an idea of the difference here between a research question and a research hypothesis. The next two research terms that I want to have you all become familiar with is the term empirical and the term primary research. Empirical is a term you'll often hear thrown about in regards to different types of studies, but empirical studies or empirical research is based on or concerned with or verifiable by observation or experience rather than just theory or pure logic or expert opinion. So empirical research is a study where they've taken actual subjects, done something to them, and observed the effects. So the previous example I gave where they used two different types of foam rollers, measured something about recovery, and then published the results, that would be empirical research because it's based upon observation and experience, not just theory. It's not just a best guess. It's actually been studied by measuring something before, doing something with the clients or the subjects, and then measuring something at the end and publishing what the results were. So that's empirical. That's what empirical means. Primary research is empirical research. So if you hear an article called a primary research study, that means the authors actually came up with a hypothesis and they tested the hypothesis by gathering subjects, doing something to them, taking measurements typically before and after, and seeing what the results were. So they verified their conclusions by observing and studying these subjects. So primary research is empirical research. Those two terms really go hand in hand. And a lot of the studies that you will read are going to be primary research articles. The problem with primary research articles is that they often are really, really focused. So they look at the effect of one particular variable on a particular group of people. So when you read primary research, it can be really interesting, but it might not be on the subjects that, types of subjects that you actually work with, or it may not use the exact type of equipment or intervention that you have available to you. So you have to, when you read this primary research, you have to look at the specific things to see how closely it matches your subjects and your situations. But primary research is the main type of research that you'll probably be reading when you try to answer these types of clinical questions. Primary research is empirical, as I said. Again, it's based upon observation. It's based upon studies. So here is an example of a primary research article. It's actually the abstract from the title of the article I gave you on the previous couple of slides ago, where the subjects or the authors were examining the effects of a non-vibration foam roller and a vibrating foam roller to look at a number of different measures of recovery. So let's dive into this a little bit so you get an idea of what they were looking at. So they're comparing the effects of a non-vibration foam roller to a vibration foam roller on visual analog scale. That's a pain measure pressure pain threshold, oxygen saturation, the counter movement jump, so how high can they jump, and a hip and knee range of motion. So they took a lot of measures, and again, probably measured these before the person participated in this exercise that made them sore, probably measured them after exercise. So the protocols were measured previously, and then 48 hours post-exercise. That's usually when peak delayed onset muscle soreness occurs, and then both before and immediately after treatment, so that they got to see, where were they after they made the person sore, and then where were they in these measures after they did the intervention with the foam roller. And again, this is primary research. They took subjects, they did something to them, and they took measurements before and after. And again, you can see what the findings are here. I'm not going to read you all of them, but the conclusions were basically that there was improvement in most of the measures for both the foam rolling and the and the vibrating foam roller. However, there were greater improvements in both pain and hip range of motion after the vibrating foam roller. So there did seem to be, in this study, some additional benefits of the vibration that the foam roller produced beyond just the foam roller by itself. But this is how we can use, again, this primary research to help us make these clinical decisions. So some other research terms I want to go over. Secondary research. Now, primary research is where the authors themselves conducted the study, reported on the research, and so on. Secondary research are research publications where pre-existing data or the findings of others is utilized or summarized. So review articles, meta-analyses are examples of secondary research. Now, before we kind of give some examples of these, primary research is where the authors actually observed the subjects, measured the measurements, and so on. More reliable, therefore, because they saw what happened, they measured what happened, and they made conclusions upon it. Secondary research is where someone takes a whole bunch of articles, typically that are conducted by other people, and then makes conclusions on those. Because it's secondary, they didn't collect the data themselves. There's a chance that the secondary researchers could make false assumptions and so on. So it's not seen as bad research by any means, but it's not as reliable because it's not primary. But secondary research certainly is a great source of information and a great way to really learn about where a big research question is at the moment. So secondary research basically comes in two main types. The first is a systematic review of the literature. The second is what's called a meta-analysis, and let me explain them here. First off, here's a systematic review, or an example of a systematic review. Kind of one of the big studies, if you do any research on self-myofascial release, this one's utilized a lot, but it's a systematic review. The title is The Effects of Self-Myofascial Release Using a Foam Roll or Roller Massager on Joint Range of Motion, Muscle Recovery, and Performance. A systematic review. What does that mean? That means these authors, they didn't collect any data themselves, but what they did was they looked in the literature in a systematic way. We're going to learn more about literature searches next week or in the next unit. But what they did was they searched the literature for all of the studies that examined the effects of self-myofascial release using a foam roll on any of these measures: joint range of motion, muscle recovery, and performance. Because there's a lot of research that's been done on this topic. They've done a lot of good work for us because if you look at the studies on self-myofascial release, some show a very significant benefit to range of motion, some show a mild benefit, some show no benefit. So the research that's out there isn't perfectly clear. So what Cheatham and his co-authors have done is they've gone out and they've found all those articles, and what they've attempted to do is summarize them all for us to give us a good overview of what the literature as a whole says about these different things. That's why a systematic literature review is such a great place to start your analysis on a topic, assuming that a systematic review exists. Because what it does is it goes out and it reads all of those primary research articles and summarizes them for us. However, as I mentioned, there is always a chance that if the authors have a bias or something, that they make incorrect assumptions. However, through the peer review process, the hope is that they've made correct assumptions and summarized the research in an unbiased way. But a systematic review is an example of secondary research. It's written by authors who used other primary resources to make their conclusions. A meta-analysis goes a little further than a systematic review. Systematic review doesn't involve any recalculation of any statistics. They just say, hey, these 5 articles found this, so in the end we conclude that this technique works, or the evidence shows that myofascial release does in fact increase range of motion. A systematic review does not, however, do any mathematic calculations. A meta-analysis does go that other step. So a meta-analysis, an example I have here, is influence of static stretching on hamstring flexibility in healthy young adults, systematic review, and a meta-analysis. So what these authors have done is they have gone and collected a whole bunch of articles looking at static stretching and hamstring flexibility in a young, healthy adult population. Again, there's lots of studies out there that have examined this, and they're going to summarize that for us and tell us, does static stretching work? What attributes of static stretching, length of stretching, type of stretching, what works best? So they're going to give us a lot of good information. What they have done, though, in a meta-analysis is they've actually taken the data that's been reported by different studies, put all of that data together in a new data set, and rerun some additional findings to try to see, again, if we combine all of these different studies, what do we find? Do we find that hamstring flexibility is increased with static stretching or not? So that's the difference between a systematic review and a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis takes the findings of a bunch of primary studies, combines all of the data, and reruns some type of analysis. If we take a look at the abstracts of those 2 articles, and again, I'm not going to read them to you here, what you will see, obviously, in a meta-analysis that you don't see in a systematic review is some type of statistical treatment to the data that has kind of give us not only kind of the author's opinions of what the various studies say, but they've run their own study and their own data based upon the data that was collected by other individuals. While this does have some limitations, it does help give us an answer, especially in cases where there's a lot of studies and the studies had conflicting results, some showing an effect, some not showing an effect. But a meta-analysis and a systematic review are both examples of secondary research and can be a great way to kind of grasp and get a hold of the status of a particular research question. The last term that I want to go over is peer-reviewed research journal. Again, I'm going to require you to find articles in this course from peer-reviewed research journals. Peer-reviewed research journal means these are journals, these are publications where research is published, but it undergoes the process of peer review. So peer-reviewed research journals are places where studies are published that have been examined and vetted by other researchers in the field. They accept studies that meet certain format, methodological, and other criteria. What it does, if the article has undergone peer review, it allows the reader to place greater confidence in the findings because experts, people have done similar research, can examine the article, make sure that they use the correct equipment, they took the measurements in the right way, they made sure there wasn't some outside influence on the results, and so on. So peer-reviewed research journals are going to be the most, respected and place to find results of research. I think it's always to talk about non-peer-reviewed research publication as well. So again, you might find a research study that was done on the effectiveness of, vibration foam rollers, right? If you find that article in a peer-reviewed research journal, we can be fairly confident that very confident that the research was conducted in a way that wasn't biased, they used the correct techniques, and so on. If we find a study for that type of equipment on the a website for a company that makes the equipment, we have to be very careful. That's not peer reviewed. We don't know that they really were unbiased in their conclusions. We don't know that, again, that they use the correct methodology in collecting their data. So that's a non-peer reviewed research format. And that's, again, we can't put a lot of faith in those type of journals. Again, same thing for a lot of the websites that maybe you utilize to find information. They're great places to get ideas, but we always want to verify the conclusions that that individuals make, even if they're experts in the field, by going in and looking at the primary and secondary research that's out there that has been published in peer-reviewed research journals. Again, peer-reviewed research journals will publish systematic reviews, meta-analyses, as well as primary research articles. So peer-reviewed research can be either primary or secondary research, but to be in these journals, it's often very difficult to get published in some of these journals. They have to meet, your article would have to meet specific formatting restrictions. They would have to verify that they have protected human subjects. We'll talk more about that in a future presentation. They need to be reviewed by experts in the field that will read and, again, potentially require revisions of writing style, the methods, the results, and the conclusions that have been found. And then often the publication or the initial submission from the authors will need to be revised several times before they will be published in the journal. So often these journals have very strict, again, peer review requirements in order to be published.